I am delighted to be joined today by Dave Dayan of the American Prospect, who's been doing great work over at the Prospect. I've been reading in my daily bath, unsanitized, and it's the only thing really. I mean, really, corporate media, they're focusing on the play-by-play, but not the actual in the weeds economic aspects here. So, Dave, can we just start? July 26th is my understanding of when the $600 a month unemployment ends. Is that correct?
Yeah, that'd be the last week. So really just 2 weeks more of enhanced $600 in people's unemployment checks before it expires under the CARES Act. And it could be catastrophic. I mean, you see 30 million plus people relying on this enhanced unemployment to pay their bills, to pay their mortgage, car payments, whatever, just basic survival. And it's become a large part of our income levels in this country. I mean, if that many people are out of work. So if you cut that to nothing, or even to $200 a week instead of $600, that's a significant chunk of income just falling in the drop of a hat. And think about what that means for overall consumer spending and what that would mean for more layoffs, more unemployment. You'd have this vicious cycle created. So I'm extremely concerned about what is going to happen. And the Senate's not even in session this week. So we're going to have 1 week to figure this out.
What's incredible to me is basically, on paper, the unemployment, the $600 a week, you know, for a lot of people, they're making more than they did at work. But you and I were going back and forth earlier. I mean, there's been a lot of problems just getting the unemployment. You know, we don't have numbers, but not everybody has gotten the unemployment that's eligible for it. Then you get to this point where we might have another like debt ceiling showdown with, you know, the countdowns on cable news. Maybe they'll have like a deal on the last day. But if they do it at the deadline, again, people have already had trouble getting the unemployment that are eligible. So wouldn't that just create even further of a delay if they extend the unemployment at a reduced amount?
It could. We're finally starting to hear a little bit more in the media about people who have been delayed for weeks and weeks on this unemployment claims processing. There was a big story in the LA Times and a story in the Washington Post in the last 2 days about this. And, you know, you have people waiting 8 weeks, 10 weeks, having to survive on their savings before they get their unemployment checks coming in. And they all are supposed to come in for that back pay, like from the week that they start initiating the claims process. But there's damage in the meantime. I mean, if you don't get it in a certain amount of weeks and you rely on weekly pay to cover your bills, you could lose your car, you could lose your house. All of those things could happen. And I'm worried about if they change the level of this weekly enhancement. Let's say it goes from $600 to $300, and somebody is in the middle waiting to get that check, to get their claim processed. And now the state unemployment systems, which are totally backwards, old technology, some of them use COBOL, which is like a 1950s era programming language. Now they have to figure out, okay, you get 7 weeks at the $600 benefit, and then you get 3 other weeks at the $300 benefit. That sounds easy, but for these computer systems, it's not. And I guarantee you there's going to be problems there. And that will create further confusion, more delays, and it has a real-world effect.
Bottom line, I mean, you look at it, all the while, I mean, state to state is different, but the evictions, the moratoriums are starting. It's not like the rent was canceled, so there's back pay owed for, I mean, in most cases. So the Republicans, if they're going to do anything, they want, you know, to cement corporate liability. If workers get sick, they are talking about a, you know, bonus if you come back to work, which goes back to this, like, just to hell with health, you know, rush people back to work and incentivize people. And Democrats, you know, are talking, to me, it seems like they're talking, the unemployment extension, but a bunch of other things that are not really immediate. So, yeah.
The signing, yeah, I mean, the signing bonus is insane to me. Like, the idea in the beginning in March, we were paying people not to go to work, and that was like a strategy because the virus was such that we wanted to lock everybody down so we could suppress it. Now we're going to be paying people to go back to work when the virus is at a same level, if not higher, than it was in March. That's absolute insanity. And that's going to create so much more pain than we have right now, both from a public health standpoint and economically. I mean, just in the last couple hours, Gavin Newsom has come out and shut down a lot of indoor activities. It's almost a return to the lockdown in the state of California. And now you're going to have this mechanism where you pay people to go back to work. And when the state health system is telling you should not go in, I mean, this doesn't make any sense. They don't play together. It's not complementary. And so that's a serious thing that Democrats and Republicans have to think about when they're going to put together this last minute final bill.
And I saw Nancy Pelosi Speaker Pelosi on Sunday shows yesterday. You did a great piece last week explaining her rise, and kind of, a lot of people think of her as a San Francisco liberal. Not the case. But I kept hearing her with, I think it was Dana Bash yesterday, saying, well, they prioritize corporations in the first bill, and a lot of they. But I mean, she signed on to all of this really when she didn't have to. The Democrats had leverage, and she signed on to all of this, but she kept on putting it off on Republicans. What's the fact or fiction? Because it seems like Pelosi has really squandered all her capital.
Well, I agree. I mean, this is a bill, when you're talking about the CARES Act, that passed 96-0 in the Senate. It passed unanimously. They didn't even do a voice. It was a voice vote. They didn't even do a recorded vote in the House. Pelosi has never said one bad thing about the CARES Act. She's touted the many provisions in it. And now, when it's shown to be inadequate, she's trying to shift blame. We did a piece today about how the way the CARES Act was structured, the fact that it didn't give state and local governments money to cover the revenue shortfalls that they were going to have, led to states and cities prematurely reopening and creating these new surges. We actually got data from a political science professor from Marquette that showed a relationship. If you, as a state, relied more on individual income tax, you were more likely to reopen. And so that's a direct correlation to not having this certainty of state and local fiscal relief. And that was, it was this haphazard bill, the CARES Act, that was kind of thrown together. The pieces didn't fit. It tended to make states and cities more desperate and more likely to reopen. And of course, matter of the $4.5 trillion Federal Reserve money cannon that was also in the bill. In fact, the largest part of the bill. So the relief that was given to corporations was permanent, and the relief given to individuals was temporary. And now we're seeing the end of that temporary relief, and we're now scrambling again. And hopefully we won't make the exact same mistakes that we made with the first bill in the second. And so, yes, I wrote this thing about it. There was a biography of Nancy Pelosi that came out earlier this year, and it was a review of that book and really a review of Pelosi. And not just her history, but her response in this pandemic and what it says about her leadership. So that's over.
And could you kind of explain, because, the unemployment, again, sounds good on its face, but if we keep going, at this deadlines, there's no certainty for people because they're pretty much.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Pelosi had the opportunity to, in her bill, the HEROES Act, or kind of wish list, the left poll in the debate, to create what is called automatic stabilizers. And what that means is you keep the benefit until the crisis is over, and you base it on the unemployment rate. So if unemployment is still over 10%, you're going to keep things the same with the same benefit. And if it drops below a certain threshold, then you start to ease it out. That's not what was done. So we have instead a time-limited situation where every few months there's going to be this hysteria over what we're going to do. Pelosi said she wouldn't put in automatic stabilizers because they cost too much money. That they and not even that they cost too much money, that they would be scored as costing too much money by the Congressional Budget Office, which is not like the law, but just sort of an advisory board that looks at what various pieces of legislation will cost and can be overridden at any time. But Pelosi, by artificially constraining herself, has created this endless situation of stops and starts and stops and starts, which creates governing in crisis. And governing in crisis in the recent history has led to giant corporate bailouts. It could lead, in this case, to giant corporate liability releases. So it hasn't been a good thing if you're an ordinary individual. And so, you know, I think that is part of the reckoning that we should have around Speaker Pelosi's
And can you kind of talk about, it seems like the Republicans now, it wasn't enough to give, you know, $4 to $6 trillion to corporate America. Now they're talking about capital gains cuts. Like, what rationale could they come up with that tax capital gains cuts are going to help the economy? I mean, it just seems like not even subtle highway robbery.
Yeah, there's absolutely none. And you know, there were a bunch of tax breaks for the rich already in the CARES Act, in the first bill. There were things on carry forward loss depreciation and really obscure, dumb-sounding things that you don't have to know what they're about, except that they give hundreds of billions of dollars to rich people. So that was already in the first bill. Now we're going to have a second bill where we want to do the same thing, another bite at the apple. Capital gains, as we know, are going like gangbusters. So when the Federal Reserve stepped in and said, we're going to take control of the stock market and nobody's going to have to worry, the stock market went from, I believe it was at 18,000 on March 23rd, and it's at 26,000 today. So that's a lot of capital gains, right? And all of that, if you sell your stock, would have to be paid for in taxes. So this is, you created the run, you created the bubble, and now you're going to get investors off the hook from having to pay their fair share of the bubble to the government under federal law. So there's just a whole lot of craziness going on there. And it's really indicative of who matters.
And my last question is, I mean, bottom line, like real world, what are people supposed to do? I mean, because landlords are chomping at the bit to evict people. Already, people are going to housing courts. I was just on a road trip interviewing folks that are facing possible eviction. And we're talking 2.5 weeks tops between the unemployment. Could we see a huge uptick in homelessness?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we wrote a piece, there's a piece by Michael Sainato, a freelancer today, on our site, just talking to people about what would happen if the unemployment insurance ran out, the enhanced benefit. And people are like, you know, that's the reason I'm not in my car right now. That's the reason I have a house. That's the reason that, you know, I'm able to survive, is that extra $600 a week. You know, the idea that this is a disincentive to employment, when employment for the in May and June went up by, you know, 7 million people. It was not a disincentive to employ. The disincentive to employment is the fact that there's a deadly virus out in the world. That's the disincentive to employment, not the extra $600 a week that you're giving to people in the hopes that they can survive until we get our heads together and actually try to stop this virus. So it is a very tragic situation that we are on the precipice of. And you know, the fact that the Senate is out this week, the lack of seriousness at this absolute crisis that we're staring down is really shameful. And you know, to the extent that people need to speak up about this, you know, people were out in the streets over racial justice. This is about economic justice. It affects a lot of the same people. You know, I don't think there's anything more important to be out in the streets about in the near term than this right now, which all plays together. Racial and economic justice are completely intertwined.
Dave Dayen, American Prospect, doing great stuff. Thanks for joining me. Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.